My name is Brian Washburn, and I am with a company called Endurance Learning. We put together all sorts of training programs, whether they're big or small. We'll put together programs that are instructor-led, in person. We'll put together virtual sessions. We'll put together e-learning, and then we'll do a lot of train the trainer stuff as well. And so we're gonna get into some of those kind of tips, tricks, techniques when it comes to designing training. I'll talk a little bit more about the overview here in just a second. But I'm seeing people from all over the place, and hello to everyone. We even have somebody from Zambia, which is great. So good evening to the folks that might be a little bit even further east than the east coast of the U.S. Um, I would also love, as people, I see people are starting to drop a lot of stuff into the chat here. There's a few other things that I'd love to know about you all, not just your name and where you're from as we get going here, but some things that are going to help me kind of figure out where I might want to spend a little bit more time as we talk here today. We're talking about instructor-led training that doesn't waste time or break the bank. And we'll be talking about some informal training strategies. We'll be talking about just some good instructional design strategies. And we'll also be talking about some ways to have conversations with people who might request training that may or may not be necessary. So we'll get into that a little bit. But the first thing I want to do is figure out, all right, so now that I know where you're from, what is something you'd like to take away from the next 60 minutes or so that we're here? And I'm going to wait for some of those answers to come in. I'm going to ask you another question here. So, something you'd like to take away from the next 60 minutes. As I mentioned, we'll be talking a little bit more about instructor-led training, but we're also going to be talking about maybe some ways to avoid instructor-led training as well. So I'm just going to take a look here. So some effective training strategies, about to relaunch an in-person ILT and hoping to get some great ideas. A new strategy for engagement training that doesn't waste time. I love that thought because we're going to try to focus a little bit on that. We're actually going to do some calculations as well when it comes to the math behind how much it costs to put a program together, not just in terms of the development time, but also the seat time. How much there's a cost when people actually spend some time sitting in seats taking a training, whether it's instructor-led or e-learning or things like that. Engagement opportunities. I really want to know more engagement and keep it interesting. I love all these thoughts, and people who are saying engagement, we actually might want to put together an entire session just focused on engagement strategies. Today, we're talking a little bit more about strategic thinking around training. So I just want to kind of calibrate some expectations here as well. How to get management to commit to training. I love that thought because we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we provide and present value to management if they're going to request training or if we want to request that we have funding for training. And then there's going to be another thought or another question that I have. I promise, last question you'll have to type into the chat for a little bit. We will do some polls, we'll do some other chats. So if this is one of those webinars where you're thinking, oh, I was going to log on, but then I was going to go do some other things while I'm listening, there are going to be some other things that come up. So we're going to want to pick your brain via poll as well as through the chat. My second question here is, ooh, I like that last thought that Samita added here, doing more with minimum effort. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that I wanted to know a little bit more is if you think of your current programs, your own organization or in your own practice, if you're a consultant, if you're not internal to an organization, what do you wish could be more efficient? So give me a little bit of a thought on that. When you think of your own L&D programs, what do you think could be more efficient? Again, going back to that last comment that Samita put in there, doing more with minimum effort. Where do you think some efficiencies can be gained? Oh, the back and forth with SMEs and development process. That is a great question. I'm going to touch on that a little bit as we get going here, or actually towards the end here. We'll talk a little bit about some questions that'll be really important to ask when it comes to working with SMEs. Honing in on the desired outcome, we'll talk about that as we get going, probably in the second half of the session. Only teaching people who actually need the knowledge and skills. We're gonna actually walk through a little bit of a flow chart to figure out is training necessary, and what skills are we trying to build skills, and for whom? Switching trainings from in-person online and vice versa. I don't know if we'll get too much into that, but we can definitely have some of those conversations here. Then certainly I'm going to offer some invitations for some virtual coffee and things like that. So there'll be some links as we get going. Keep putting those thoughts into the chat. Aaron, if anything pops up for that you're seeing that would be really good to kind of call out as we get started, please do sift through those responses and call those out as well. I do want to mention that as you're continuing to put these answers in here, this whole program today really revolves around a book that I had a chance to write, and it was published and released about a year ago, called Instructional Design on a Shoestring. Now, here's a shameless plug. If you do want to pick this book up, feel free to scan that QR code. But real quick, this isn't just a sales pitch, right? This is giving you a little bit more about the inspiration for what we're about to talk about for the next 53 minutes now. And this book is really about how do you get more efficient with your learning programs? And do you even need formal training? Are there ways to skirt around this idea of a training request if training isn't really going to be the thing that solves the problem? If you were to take a look at this book, there are some other things that we're not going to talk about today that are in there. So things like building e-learning or building the learning ecosystem, things like borrowing the time and talent of others or borrowing inspiration from anywhere. That's when people talk about engagement strategies and things you're hoping to get away. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about specific activities and things like that today, but this book actually does go into how do we find where in nature, like if we go outside, where can we find inspiration for some different engagement strategies? So things like museums and advertisements and marketing and games and communities of practice and our coworkers. So the book will talk about lots of other things as well as kind of if we had to not just kind of create something on our own, but we were going to pay for convenience or pay for an extra set of hands or pay for off-the-shelf solutions. It talks a little bit about how to approach that as well. But let's bring it back to what we're going to talk about here today, and really we're going to focus on how ruthless can we be? And I actually have a quiz for you that you'll be able to download, and a colleague is going to post that into the chat in a little bit. We're also going to talk about alternatives to robust formal training. So we don't always need training, but what would be an alternative? There's a lot. If you lurk around LinkedIn, there's always a lot of conversation around, oh, nothing should be training, right? It should all be job aids. It should be all demand on demand. That's not feasible. It's not realistic. However, it's also not realistic to think that training is going to solve all of our problems. And so we probably do need a mix. And so if we want to be more efficient, we do need to figure out, do we need training? And if not, what can we put in place that could help to replace that training? And then finally, let's explore some ways to make the design and development of robust training a little bit more efficient. Before I get into the actual meat of this presentation, Aaron, were you seeing anything else in the chat that could be really interesting for that people were saying that they wanted to take away from today, or something that they feel could be more efficient in their own organizations?
Nothing new. There was a comment about switching trainings from in-person to online and vice versa. And I think at the end, we may get into some new ways that we can talk about that for a future webinar, but nothing new right now.
Great. And I love those conversations because those will help us to plan out some ideas for future webinars. Now, when we think about building instructor-led training more efficiently, there are all sorts of ways that money can be spent on training. So when we think about it, you can hire a vendor, you can buy content off the shelf, you can purchase software license, right? These are all ways to spend money. You can purchase, the Articulate suite for Storyline and Rise or Captivate, or if you're using a different program, learning management systems, things like that. You can also spend time, like even if you're developing this internally, it's not free just because people have salaries. There's an opportunity cost to what people are doing and what they're not doing. And so spending time developing, and then the time your learners actually spend learning. That's one thing that we don't always think about, but that is one of the biggest, I think, inefficiencies in learning just across organizations and around the world. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that actually looks like and how much time and money is involved when we bring participants into an instructor-led training or even e-learning, right? So if we mandate people take a 20-minute e-learning, there's a cost to that. We're going to talk about that for just a sec in just a minute. But before we get to that, we're going to go back to the chat. And I'm kind of curious if you had to guess, how much time on average would you say that it takes to develop a 20-minute just instructor-led training? So this is, short, right? So if we're thinking kind of maybe a lunch and learn or something that has 20 minutes of content, how much time would you say that it takes to actually develop instructor-led training? We have some different ranges. We're seeing 40 hours. So an entire week is one of the things I'm seeing. 8 hours. Britt mentioned if I was to actually guess this without actually having seen the data, I would probably put it a little bit less than 8 hours. I always use the rule of thumb. It takes about 8 hours to create 1 hour of training. But the actual the research and the data is a little surprising. All right, keep those approximately 1 hour for every minute. Interesting. Okay. So keep those thoughts in mind. Now I'm going to switch the question a little bit. How much time, for those of you who are using e-learning, how much time do you think that it takes to create about 20 minutes of e-learning? I like what Katie put in here with the time that it takes to go back and forth to approve things. It inflates the amount of time to create something, which is a really I love that thought because a lot of times we just think, how much time does it take just for heads down to create something? But oftentimes we can't create training just by sitting in front of our computer for 4 hours or 8 hours or 40 hours, whatever it is. There's a lot of back and forth that is involved. Now I'm taking a look and seeing, all right, so the amount of time to create about 2 hours of e-learning, I'm seeing it depends. I'm seeing 5 hours, 2 hours, 10 hours. The it depends answer, I think that is for a thinking person, that is a pretty universal answer. And for somebody who's giving out a pop quiz and looking for a number, it's an obnoxious answer, but it's actually it's probably the best answer that we can put up there. Now let's go to some of the data, and this comes from research that Robin DeFelice has done, and she'll publish blog posts, she'll publish articles in TD Magazine and things like that. The most recent data that I could find came back from 2021. She may have more recent data, so forgive me if this is not her most recent data. But if we take a look at just 20 minutes of instructor-led learning. It's about 67 hours on average to create just 20 minutes of instructor-led training. And I think that a lot of that has to do with going back and forth between subject matter experts and trying to put something together. That also includes putting together the slides and lesson plans and things like that. And if we're to do a little bit of financial calculation in that, I looked on Glassdoor, the average salary for an instructional designer on Glassdoor across the country is $44 an hour. It seems like that might be a little bit low. If you can find a really top-notch instructional designer for $44 an hour, please send them my way. But that's a little bit, so it's about $3,000 just to develop, not including the amount of time people actually spend learning, but it's about $3,000. And so if we were to kind of multiply that by three to take a look at a 60-minute session, which is pretty typical, it could take 201 hours and $8,900 to put together. When we're talking about e-learning, there's a cost to that as well, about 48 hours on average to create a 20 minutes of basic e-learning. This is just click through, right? So to put that together, and then putting together a highly interactive e-learning on average is about 155 hours. And if you multiply that by $44 an hour, you get 68.20. So there's cost to developing learning. So if we're going to develop learning, it needs to be really effective. And if not, I'm going to show you what happens and what kind of waste we have here. And this is when it comes to instructor-led training. Let's say we have 20 people that are going to attend a session. And most of our sessions, maybe it's an hour or things like that. Sometimes we have retreats. Let's go to kind of a little bit more of an extreme case. Let's say we put 20 people together to spend 3 days during a workshop, right? So it could be some sort of executive man how to manage people. It could be something around new employee orientation, whatever it might be. Let's say we do 20 people. Let's say that we put them together for 3 days. And let's use that $44 an hour some because that's just kind of let's assume that everyone makes what we do as instructional designers, even though this number is really low. And that will come out to be about $21,000, not including the amount of time developing it. This is what we're spending. So this is why training needs to be really efficient. And when we come to e-learning, the nice thing about it is it's scalable, but the challenge or the danger with e-learning is it's scalable. So let's slap this e-learning for 200 people, not just 20 people. And let's say it's just 20 minutes. And so for 200 people taking 20 minutes of learning, that's about 67 hours of work time. Let's say that they made $44 an hour, which seems pretty low. You're spending $3,000 just on people to focus on a 20-minute compliance e-learning. And if they have to take 5 different courses, that's $15,000. If you have a larger organization, you have 2,000 people taking it, this is real money. And so the question that I have here, and I see that people are mentioning in the comments that those numbers are low. Yes, that $44 an hour is low. If so, best case scenario, this is kind of the money that we're spending by having people take training. And so a driving question for us needs to be, do we even need training? So let's take a common scenario, a common situation, and let's work through it. Let's think through this. Let's say that we have an HR director that comes to us and asks us to create a training. This seems to be a pretty common situation, right? The finance team's rolling out a new online expense reporting tool for the organization, and they'd like all employees to be trained on how to use this system and accurately submit expense reports for reimbursement. All right, so this is pretty typical. We have a new system we're rolling out. Here, the example is expense reporting. So we want people to be trained on how to use this so they can accurately put the numbers in and then they can be reimbursed and finance is happy because the system, might streamline work and save them time or whatever it might be. So here's where we're going to put up our first poll. So my question to you is, should you develop this training, whether it's ILT that can be used for HR or it's e-learning that can be uploaded to the LMS? What do you think? You want to give me a yes or no? There is no it depends option here because I just love to kind of hear, given just the basic facts, should we develop a training here? Do we want to keep our people in HR happy? I love watching poll results in real time. Oh, somebody asked, here, let me put the scenario back up here. So I'm going to put the scenario back up on the screen. Obviously, the poll's up on the screen, so you don't need to see the choices. So the HR director comes to you, asks you to create a training. The finance team's rolling out a new online expense reporting tool for the organization, and they'd like all employees to be trained on how to use this system and accurately submit the expense reports for reimbursement. This is just to make sure that the finance folks the system they've invested in is used. The finance folks don't have to keep answering questions, and people who need their reimbursements can get those in a timely manner. All right, it looks like we have all the votes we're getting that we're gonna get here. Um, I I love working with people who are in training and then looking at the comments because like Tito has a question, how is this software to use? Maybe a 3-page document's enough, right? So the the reason I laugh at that is because this is what we should be doing, right? We should be asking questions, right? So we have a scenario, but unfortunately, we have this whole 60-minute webinar. We're 21 minutes in. I have lots of other things to get to, so we're not actually going to have some back and forth in terms of what this is. So there's just a yes or no. Should we develop this? Yes or no? And let's go ahead and share those results. All right, so we're a little bit split. So we have about 60% of the people say yes, let's develop it. Let's keep HR happy. Let's keep finance happy. And about 41% of the people said, nope, let's not do this. All right, so sometimes there will be some things that we're going to be like, yep, okay. Politically, we will earn more by creating a training, right? So we will. There's a lot of reasons to do this, and sometimes we will be like, I don't think that training's a good answer, and so sometimes we'll have to say no. I'm not saying we'll analyze this situation a little bit more in just a minute, but let me ask you this question. We're going to put up another poll here, and my question here is if you had to say no to a client who asked you to design training for them, how comfortable are you in saying no to somebody who says, "Hey, I know that you're in training. I have this thing. I need training developed." So give me some thoughts here in terms of how comfortable you are saying no. Our choices are the customer's always right. I don't say no. Maybe in extreme cases, I'll say no. It makes me anxious, but I'll do it. I've grown more comfortable over the years, and I relish the opportunity to say no. We have a distribution right across. This is it's always this is why I love to use polling tools. I'm just taking a look at the chat here. I just said no to someone on Monday. I helped them come to the conclusion. So these responses here are a little bit tongue in cheek. I love what Jennifer said. You know, I helped them come to the conclusion. So it's not usually going to be something where somebody says, "Hey, can you help me develop training?" And our response is no, and then we just walk away. I think that there's Allison says, as a parent and professional, you learn to say no without saying it directly. All right, so let's go ahead and share these results. And we have a broad spectrum, right? So we have some people who say the customer is always right. I don't say no. We have a lot of the answers are kind of those middle three responses. So maybe in extreme cases, I'll say no. It makes me anxious, but I'll do it. That's probably where I fall in this category. I've grown more comfortable over the years. I'm trying to get there, and then I relish the opportunity to say no. There's probably another piece to that last sentence. I relish the opportunity to say no and help people find their alternatives. So thank you for kind of indulging us in these thoughts. Now, there is in the chat, my colleague Rachel is going to drop just a resource. This comes from the Instructional Design on a Shoestring book, but just a questionnaire about how ruthless you can be. Because if we're talking about trying to be more efficient, more economical with some of the stuff that we are creating, then we do need to be ruthless. And the reason for that is because the number one way that we can reduce training waste and make our L&D efforts more efficient is by not creating training. This is efficient for us and it's efficient for the learners if we find that training itself is not actually going to be the solution that leads to the results we're looking for. Now, saying no can be difficult. So I'm going to share a resource here, or a tool, kind of a process, kind of a flow chart that we can use, and this can be helpful. Now, this is a model, right? So all models are wrong. Some models are useful. I find this useful. It won't always be correct. However, if we can start to ask ourselves a series of yes or no questions, we can get to the idea of should we develop training, or are there other things that we can put in place that will save us time and it will save everybody who needs to learn this time. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start with these questions, right? So the first question when it comes to training, right? We need training that we might want to be thinking about is, well, is there a performance gap, right? So this is a lot of times when it comes to training, training's about skill building and engaging people in performance. Now, that's not always the case, right? So sometimes people will want training as some sort of team building activity, or sometimes we might need to put together a training because we can send out an email that has the information, but nobody's going to read it. So we need people to do it, right? So there's lots of reasons why we do training beyond skill building, but if we want to be really efficient, these are some questions we should be asking ourselves. So, is there a performance gap? And if the answer is no, then the fact is that there's no training that's needed, right? So job aids could be helpful as reminders or awareness tools. So that's one thing to think about. But if the answer is yes, right? So if there's a performance gap, then we need to ask, well, is the performance gap due to a lack of knowledge or skill? If the answer is no, then training's not going to help this, right? So if it's not just about knowledge or skill, we might need to do something else. So it could be coaching, could be feedback, could be tools, job aids, incentives, motivation strategies, lots of other thoughts. Training is not the be all and end all. And this is where we in the training field can get ourselves in trouble. When we say yes to because somebody has asked for training without asking a lot of other questions, training might not solve the problem. So if we create something and the problem still exists, then we're going to be blamed. And so making sure that we're taking a look at some of these things with a critical eye can be really, really helpful. Right. So if the performance gap is due to a lack of knowledge or skill, then what we want to do is say, okay, well, is the task performed frequently? Right. So is it something that somebody needs to do a lot? And if the answer is yes, you probably want training there, right? So we want this is about skill or knowledge, and they need to do this a lot. So we probably do want training in that case. Now, here's the thing. If the answer is no, maybe we need to ask a few other questions. And so if it's not performed frequently, if it's something about knowledge or skill, but it's not performed frequently, um, well, is there a high risk if the performance is done incorrectly? Because if things aren't you if people aren't doing things frequently, if you don't use it, you'll lose it, right? People will forget. Even if you send people to training and then they don't use it for 3 months, what do we do about that? So if it's a high risk, right? If there could be big problems, even though they don't do it a lot, but they're going to need to know how to do this, we need robust training, and we probably need some other things. So we probably need some practice, some reinforcement between when they've been trained and when they actually have to use it. So if there's other things that we can do to help people in that high risk area. Now, if the risk isn't very high, then we need to ask ourselves, well, can it be supported with a reference tool or a job aid when they need to do it, right? And so if the answer is no, then maybe we do want to consider some training combined with a reference tool. If the answer is yes, here, this is where we do the job aid, right? Or other informal support. It can be a better alternative, right? So these are just some questions to be able to ask ourselves. And thank you, Aaron, for putting this flowchart into the chat as well. So I want to go back to our original situation when people were saying yes or no, and there was about 60% of people said yes to this situation, right? We would create training for the expense reporting. So let's kind of put this situation through that flow chart. So let's take a look at that situation. Is there a performance gap? There is, right? So employees, they don't know how to use the system. So there is a problem here. So let's go on to the next thing. And the next question is, well, is the performance gap due to a lack of skill or knowledge? The answer is yes. It is a new system, new process with new steps. It's looking good. Maybe we do need training here. Is the task performed frequently? The answer here is generally it's not. Most employees might submit reports maybe 1 or 2 times a month. If they have to submit, a lot of people don't necessarily travel or need expenses reimbursed. And so some people will need it. A lot of people won't. So let's take a look at the next question. Is there a high risk if the performance is done incorrectly? And the answer to this is no. The worst case scenario might be that the person just doesn't get reimbursed as quickly as they could have. But there's not a legal thing that's going on. It's not compliance related. It's not customer sales. It's not revenue generating. It's not safety issue. So can the task be supported with a reference tool or a job aid in the moment of need? The answer here is probably yes. So when we think about this situation, now again, there's lots of reasons why we might actually say yes if the HR manager came to us and said we need to build this out. And this would be an opportunity to actually go through and ask some questions, which was the inclination when I actually put this scenario up in the first place. We had some questions floating around in the chat, and I was like, no, I'm not answering questions right now. Just yes or no, would you create it, right? But here, as we start to think through some of these questions, this could be an opportunity where we don't need to take our time and resources and create training, and other people don't need to sit through an e-learning course or an instructor-led training on how to submit expense reports. And so this would be an area where we could make it more efficient. And so this tool, this series of questions, I think could be really, really helpful in getting us to be a little bit more comfortable in saying, if it's not outright no, then it's let's think about this for a second before we actually commit the resources to not just creating this, but also people sitting through and doing this training. All right, next up, the more efficient, cost-effective, and less wasteful learning design. It really comes down to a few different things, right? So there's a few questions here. So do we need training? And if so, is that training about awareness or skills, right? So training around awareness is people should be familiar with, people should understand things. There's again, this is one of those things where we need to make sure that large groups of people are aware of something. We don't necessarily need to build their skills. I don't love that kind of training, but I can see the usefulness of it because if people aren't going to read an email, if people aren't going to open up a resource on their own, they should be aware of it. But skill building is really where training thrives, right? Another element to more efficient, cost-effective, and less wasteful training comes down to if if it's about skills, is there alignment between the outcomes and activities? We're going to talk about this in a little bit. And then if we don't need training, how else do we support our learners? I'd love to hear from you in the chat here. Going back to this idea of the HR manager suggesting that we need a training, if we were to say no, what would be some alternative to creating training for people submitting expense reports? So I'd love just to hear some thoughts in the chat. If you are somebody who relishes the opportunity to say no, what are some ways that we can redirect? If you're somebody who's like, I'm growing more comfortable saying no, or if you're like, I don't love saying no, but now you see maybe there's not a reason for this. What could be some other things that we could do as opposed to building training? So I'm seeing some thoughts in terms of source the company who created the system. I love that thought, and that goes to existing resources. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. One of the challenges that I have run into when it comes to people who create the system also creating training is that a lot of times the training is built by the people who built the system, not necessarily trainers or instructional designers. And so it's a lot of showing off the different features of the system as opposed to specific applications for the system. A video short, micro tutorials, tools, tips. I would build a one-page job aid with step-by-step instructions, coaching. I'm seeing all sorts of thoughts here. I love all of these thoughts. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that you all leave here with a whole menu of ways that we could go about getting around building training by creating informal resources. And so in the chat, Aaron's going to post um, this one-page document, right? So this is just a list of informal options. Now, there's a lot of things that are on this list, and I'm not going to have time to go through what every single one looks like, but one of the things that I find challenging when I see a list like this is, well, okay, cool, but what does this actually look like? So I'm going to walk through what a few of these could look like. And I think that some of the thoughts that you had in um, in the chat in terms of what are some alternatives to creating training appear here. So some of you may be familiar with some or many of these things. I want to just kind of explain what a few of these could actually look like. So let's kind of take a look at maybe 10 or 11 of the items that are on this list. So if you wanted to think about alternatives to training, the first one, a bulleted list, right? So if you just have a bunch of things. Now, a bulleted list would not be the appropriate thing for this HR director's request. But it could be something that's really helpful when people are trying to think what would be some alternatives to formal learning, right? For example. And this is just kind of a way just to get people thinking about some different things. Another option could be a checklist, right? So here, and you're going to see a lot of examples. I know that we have a lot of people who are joining us who are in the early learning field. You're going to see a lot of examples from early learning, but if you're in more of a corporate training setting, think about what this could look like and how this is transferable to some of the things that you could do. Now, with checklists, the reason I like this example is because sometimes with checklists there are subtasks as well. And so having kind of big picture tasks, and these are really checklists are really helpful to make sure that we're not forgetting things, right? So sometimes there's a primary task and then some subtasks that go into it that can be thrown into a checklist, and you can kind of see what you need at a glance. Another option, and this is one of the options that people were saying in terms of this, it might be what I would choose when it comes to instead of doing training, how do we actually get people familiar with with using the expense reimbursement system, and this could work really well. So a list of steps or procedures with screenshots could be really helpful. So you go step by step in terms of making sure that people know what they need to do at each step along the way. Now, one note of caution with this, if you are delivering a resource like this to somebody like me who really struggles with technology, you might want to actually test this out before you publish it and send it out to other people. So create this with the screenshots and then find somebody like me who's really not comfortable or familiar with technology and have them test it out. Because one of the things that I find most frustrating with job aids like this is when I Google something and it's like, oh yeah, just do these 4 steps. Well, between steps 3 and 4, there might have been something else that you needed to click, and it doesn't say that in the instructions. And I'm just like, this is dumb. I'm never going to use this again. I'm just going to go back to the old way, right? So anytime we do create resources like this, we want to make sure that we're going to do it with the users in mind, and make sure that it gives them the information they need. Another example of just another informal learning option, not again, not necessarily specifically related to the case we were talking about. Another option could be a flowchart, and I've given you an example of what how a flowchart can really help to kind of paint a picture and help people make some decisions. If there's a process that you're using, that could be really helpful. Another option is an illustrated guide. So think IKEA, but also think maybe we want to give a few words into this as well. When I'm putting together IKEA furniture, sometimes it goes smoothly, sometimes it doesn't. And so that can get a little tricky. So when we have illustrations along with some descriptions, that could be really helpful as well. I see that in the chat. Dana is mentioning that they generally choose some newer employees to test their information, which makes them also feel valued in the company as a newcomer. And I think that is a perfect example of how to get buy-in, but also how to make sure that the materials that we have are as robust as they need to be. Another example would be a cheat sheet, right? So if we're thinking of a quick reference guide, or a way to quickly be able to do something and we don't need to go too in depth into the steps, a cheat sheet could be really helpful. And it could look like something like this, right? So just different steps. Something else, especially if we need to take a look at people's performance, or if people want to know, shoot, what do I need to do in order to be considered successful in this performance? Another example would be a rubric, right? So giving people an idea of what success looks like at different levels of competency. Another way that we could help with some informal learning options could be distributing some sort of template or form or evaluation tool, which will help us to do a self-evaluation on some of the work that we're doing ourselves. Sometimes data is sometimes our jobs or the jobs that some people that we're working with really requires them to be able to take a look at data and get an answer like this. And so using a data table could also be a helpful way to get people the information they need at a glance. Sometimes it's a script This can be really helpful, and I've seen this helpful both in terms of in the early learning setting where we're talking about how do you engage with parents or things like that, or maybe a customer service setting, or if we have a phone call center or something like that, having a script of potential ways that people should be able to address a situation, because we can't train people on all things. We're not going to be able to script out all things either. But when we can see the words that perhaps we should be using, a script can be really, really helpful. I could even see a script being helpful for managers, especially new managers, in having coaching conversations and conversation starters and things like that. Something else that could be helpful is an FAQ document. So just having a series of questions that and answers that people will commonly ask about a system or about a process or about the organization itself. A series of video tutorials. So going back to our example with the HR director and this new system, just having some screen recordings of where to click when and how to submit things can be really helpful. Also, you see here, this is an example of behaviors that we want to see, right? So video tutorials can be very, very versatile in terms of how we want to go about sharing information. The final one that I'm going to share with you that is an informal learning option is a drip campaign. And this is an example of something that we've used in the past to distribute information after a training, but you can also just distribute this, especially if you want to make people aware of something. So you could send people a podcast or an article or a video. And I want to make the other point that sometimes it's not either or, right? So sometimes it's not either informal learning or structured learning. Sometimes we do the learning event and then we either distribute some of these informal resources for people to take and use as reference tools afterwards, or we send these out in the days, weeks, and months after a training session. So sometimes if we want to make the training more efficient, we want training to stick, these can be combined as well. Now, we did get into the question of what we would do for the HR director. So I'm going to skip over that piece of chat. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what does it mean. So we've talked about informal learning. Actually, let me pause here and see what questions you might have about when we say no, here are some alternatives to training. Let me pause here before we get into how can we be more efficient when we actually create training itself. So let's see if there's any questions before we move on here, and that will give me an opportunity to take a sip of water. One question up there is, just to clarify, you wouldn't classify this 13 options as training from an L&D perspective. So those 13 options that I shared, and there's actually more in that sheet that Aaron posted in terms of a variety of different options for informal learning. So people define training in a lot of different ways, right? So some people define training as showing up and you go through a course and you check the box that you attended and then you leave and you might not ever do anything with that again. Some people define training as something that people do and then they're actually doing something new or differently or better outside of the session. Some people define training as e-learning. Some people only define training as things that happen in person. So when it comes to those 13 options that I was sharing, I typically call those like informal learning strategies or resources, really job aids, and they can come in many different shapes or forms. I would say that they're more learning tools than they would be considered training itself as standalone pieces. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so let's get into the formal structured learning in ways we can be more efficient. And there's going to be five things here that I'm going to share with you. And so the first is we want to just, and these first two things, really, establishing clear learning objectives and then matching the learning outcomes with the objectives. They're if you've been in the world of learning and development for a while, these are kind of like, yeah, duh, I know this. What can you give me that's more innovative, Brian? I'm gonna spend a little time talking about these because it's one thing to know what these mean, and it's another thing to actually see these in action. So we'll talk a little bit about these because there there is no secret formula to making things more efficient. The thing about training and training design is work takes work. And so nothing that we do here is going to make it so that you actually don't have to do anything when it comes to training design and training delivery. But what we want to do is make sure that we're doing it in the right way. And as somebody who's been in the field of learning and development for more than 20 years, I know that these two things are really important. And yet, in my practice, I'm not always kind of matching what I think in my head to what actually shows up in a final product. I also want to talk about building on what already exists. We'll talk about using templates and frameworks, and then also two heads are better than one. So these are just some general rules of thumb. And let's get into these a little bit more in depth. So let's talk about clear learning objectives first of all. Now, if you want to go onto LinkedIn and start some sort of comment war, go ahead and mention something about learning objectives and using the words understand or know or be familiar with or things like that. Right? So there's people get very passionate about it. Now, when it comes to learning objectives, here's the reason why I get really, I'll get very particular when I'm actually developing or designing a lesson plan. So you can see that I'm using a lesson plan here as I walk through this. And the first thing I need to do is to create a clear learning objective. And the reason for this, and this goes back to what people were talking about in the very beginning of this session. What do I want to take away from this? I'd love to be able to talk to my subject matter experts a little bit more effectively. Now, this is one of the things that oftentimes we in learning and development know, we understand, we are familiar that using the words understand, know, be familiar with, recognize, things like that, they're not words, they're not verbs that we should be using when creating learning objectives. Why is that? And this is the thing that we want to really get into. We don't need to, subject matter experts don't care. They don't care about instructional design. They don't care about learning objectives and the finer points of Bloom's taxonomy and things like that, right? So they want to share information and they will have some thoughts and ideas in terms of what people should be able to do by the end of a session. Now, if we are having a conversation with a subject matter expert, and we say, okay, so what should be some objectives? And they say, well, we really need people to understand our sales process. Fine, we don't need to get into no, don't use understand, right? Let's just ask our subject matter experts to complete that sentence. We need to be able to understand our sales process so that what, right? So when we just kind of add a little bit of a sentence. Let's not put the period at the end of understand our sales process so that they can do what? We can get a little bit more information, start to paint a picture. And here's why it's important. Because when we create a training session and we have really good learning objectives, the rest of the session kind of writes itself. Our problem with this sentence is, all right, they should understand our sales process. Well, what does that look like? If we're creating instructor-led training, if we're creating e-learning, what does that look like? Well, we can put a bunch of slides together with our sales process, or I don't know. We can create all sorts of activities. We don't know what it looks like. We need to know what we can observe in order to figure out what will this look like. So let's adjust this a little bit because with this particular objective, I don't know what the training is going to look like. If we use a different word, list the steps of our sales process, I know exactly what the training will look like because at some point during the session, we need to have people list the steps of our sales process or ask open-ended questions to identify a customer's need. Maybe that's one of the steps in the sales process that we want to see if people are able to do it. Well, if that is our objective, we need to at some point have an activity in the session that says, can you ask open-ended questions to identify a customer's need? Understand the sales process doesn't get us there because we don't know what people will actually need to be able to do, right? So, or use the four steps in our sales process to recommend an appropriate solution, right? So using those steps in our sales, we need to actually see people do that. So the first and once we do that, everything else is kind of written for us. We know what we need to do. In theory, Now, let's take a look at this and see if we can match our activities with our outcomes. So, if this is our learning objective, people should be able to use the 4 steps in our sales process to recommend an appropriate solution. And then, all right, we've gone through our training and now it's time. We've introduced people to the 4 steps in our sales process. We're going to make sure that people can recommend an appropriate solution. So, it is time for Sales Jeopardy. Is this the best way that we can create training? And my answer is absolutely not. Here's the problem. When we play Jeopardy, nobody's using those 4 steps in our sales process. They might be answering questions about questions about our customer, questions about the sales process, things like that. That gives us an idea, right? That they are familiar with, or that they know, or that they can recite the steps, but they're not using the steps in our sales process. So when we want to create more engagement, and so our default is to throw out a game like Jeopardy, that is engaging, but it's not effective because we're not getting to our learning outcomes. I'm going to get off my soapbox here and I'm going to ask you, if our objective is to use the 4 steps in the sales process to recommend an appropriate solution, can you please give me in the chat a different activity that would actually match this outcome? Please help me. Please help me. I'm now fired up after having seen my own slide where there was Jeopardy, which is a fun idea. It is an engagement strategy, totally inappropriate for this particular learning objective. All right, so I see I see role play. Yes, role play is probably the way that we're going to go. I also see reverse shadowing. I see analyze a scenario with a partner. All of these activities will be better than spending 20 minutes or more playing a fun game of Jeopardy where people are going to be more interested in did I give the right answer and is my team winning than what they are learning. So, one of the things when it comes to creating more efficient training is making sure that we match the activities with the outcomes and we're not just throwing activities in there because the activities are engaging or fun. I love all of these examples. I'm going to give you some other thoughts in terms of activities and ideas in just a second. Now that we've gotten beyond this kind of nerdy instructional design, good instructional design steps, right? Those are the first 2 steps. Make sure that they're really well written learning objectives and making sure we're matching our outcomes with the activities. Also, another way to be more efficient is to build on what already exists. Many of our organizations have SharePoint or intranet or other things like that that might have really bad slide decks, but have really good information. So sometimes, even before we go to subject matter experts, we can find some of the institutional knowledge that's already there. We may also find some old training decks, some old things that we can iterate on and build upon so that we don't have to create something from scratch. We don't have to go searching for things that already are out there. The other thing that can make life so much easier and more efficient is to build on what already exists. Sometimes I sit there and I will stare at my computer screen for minutes. It could be hours. I don't know until I can find the perfect activity. And the perfect activity might already be out there. You can Google all sorts of activities you can get in Chat GPT and say, give me an activity idea. There are all sorts of ways to get inspiration. One of the things that we want to do before you leave here is give you our own inspiration. So this cookbook that Aaron is going to drop into the chat here is a resource that has 63 different activities that could help you when it comes to training. Another way that we can be more efficient is to use templates and frameworks so that we don't have to recreate something every single time. So when it comes to lesson, I was just doing a train the trainer session last week, and people were working on a lesson plan. They said, "Oh, this is going to be great because we can." I used to just kind of create some slides and put them up there, but now with the lesson plan, we can pull these up if I do this a year from now and I can remember what I have to say? So making sure that you're using templates and frameworks that can give structure and also be things that you can pull upon, that you can iterate from the next time you want to create a training session. And the final thing here is that two heads are better than one. I love putting together training. I will put it together all day. I will think it's wonderful. And then I will put it in front of my team and I will get a lot of questions and I'll be like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that? So when we can work with a colleague, a trusted colleague, whether it is somebody at the office, somebody at your local ATD chapter, a community of practice, a partner at home, whatever it might be, two heads are better than one, and they can oftentimes give you some insights into what might make your training better, and that doesn't cost any money to have people take a look over those things. We're getting towards the end. I see some people are starting to drop off. I'm going to give you three kind of summary thoughts here, and then I'm going to share a little bit of information. We have another webinar coming up next month talking about e-learning as well. So when it comes to just what I've been talking about for the past hour, really what we want to do is we want to ask what specific behavior performance needs to change. We want to ask, is it a lack of knowledge or skill that's truly the root cause of something? And will people need to recall information from memory or can it be accessed when needed? That gets into, do we even need to create training? We can be more efficient sometimes when we create resources that can help people. Sometimes if we're going to create training, let's make sure we do it really well. I went through all this stuff very quickly. If you would like to connect and grab virtual coffee with me, talk about these things in more depth, if there's a training program that you could use some help on, or a train the trainer program that you think might be really helpful to bring to your organization, my calendar is right here. I would love to talk to you about any of these things. So you can feel free to scan that code, and we can set up a time to just to have grab virtual coffee. We can nerd out over training as much as we'd like, or we can get into something specific if you have a specific thought, question, challenge that you're facing, anything like that. Uh, Keep in mind that if you do need to put together a train the trainer program, we do have this resource that can help you when it comes to building ways that whether it is your training staff or subject matter experts who deliver training would like to kind of put together a train the trainer program so that it can be effective, both in terms of how they design training and deliver it. There is a resource for you. Also, there are a couple of books out. I didn't even get to do a shameless plug for this periodic table that's behind me. But there's a couple of books. If you'd like to know a little bit more, just in terms of our training philosophy, you can feel free to take a look at that. And finally, I do want to invite you all, if you found this to be helpful, we have another webinar that's coming up next month called Beyond the Click, How to Create E-Learning That Drives Action. So if you're looking for some creative ways that you can create interactions using e-learning to see if people actually get it, right? So what are some different ways that we can use e-learning beyond just clicking through e-learning and beyond just kind of clicking on cards or matching activities or doing knowledge checks? We're going to share a variety of different samples of things that we've done that have really boosted engagement in e-learning. That's coming up next month on May 29th. And finally, if you do want to connect at all, you have my email address right there. I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn. And once again, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. I really do hope that some of these thoughts will help to make your training a little bit more efficient as you go forward. I don't have anything else to add here, so we are at the top of the hour. Happy training, everyone.